Hello and welcome to JavaScript Week 3. Today we are going to be taking a look at jQuery. So just like in general with the way JavaScript works it is a very difficult thing to teach, to be honest. And the reason it is because there's a lot of moving parts and there's a lot of APIs that you have to be aware of in order to accomplish some goals. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look at rewriting that to-do application we wrote last week, but we're going to use jQuery to do it, and we are going to bring in some additional functionality that's given to us by the jQuery UI project. So let's go ahead and I'm going to jump over to jQuery.com. Let's talk about what exactly jQuery is, or jQuery.org. jQuery is a JavaScript framework that has been in wide use for many years. It became sort of the de facto framework for writing JavaScript. Now, maybe calling it a framework might not be appropriate. It's more of a library, in that jQuery doesn't really structure anything for you as much as it makes working with JavaScript a lot easier. It's important to understand that jQuery and JavaScript are not the same thing. A lot of people get that confused for some reason. They think that jQuery is some sort of language. It really isn't, actually. jQuery is written entirely in JavaScript, and everything that's valid jQuery is valid JavaScript. You don't write anything in jQuery, although you may use it to make your code just a little bit cleaner. So the jQuery Foundation contains a couple projects. The two we're going to be looking at is jQuery, which again is the one I'm talking about today, or the primary framework, I guess, or library, I guess you could say. That again, really what it does is it just makes writing JavaScript easier. It takes care of cross-browser concerns, it shortens up the syntax, and again, historically, jQuery has been the largest library. It won the JavaScript library wars in, I believe 2006, 2007, and it's just become a de facto standard for the web. I guess that's all there is to say about it. So it is a very impressive library, and we're going to be taking a look at how we can use jQuery's functionality to make writing our to-do application simpler. Now, there's also something called jQuery UI. Now, jQuery UI is a couple user interface widgets that are built in using the jQuery extensibility framework thing, and they plug right into jQuery and let you do a lot of fun stuff. jQuery UI not only contains behavioral things, but also contains a lot of styling. Now, I will be a little bit honest about jQuery UI. I don't use it a lot, in that there are alternatives out there for a lot of stuff, but again, there are a lot of fun stuff we can use. One of them is actually going to be the Sortable doohickey right here, which just makes writing sortable lists a whole lot easier. We got a bunch of other stuff to choose from. Date Picker is another one that I use quite frequently. We have menus, progress bars, sliders, spinners, blah, blah, blah. jQuery UI also brings in some nice little effects into our project that allows us to do things like animate colors and so on for our elements. So the first thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to download jQuery. jQuery comes in a JavaScript file that you just pull down onto your page. There's something important, though, about how jQuery is currently structured. There are two versions that you're going to care about. There's the 1.9, and then there's the 2.02. Now, like it says on this documentation page right here, it says that jQuery 2 does not support Internet Explorer 6, 7, or 8. So, if you do not care about supporting those browsers, then pull down a jQuery 2.02 build. Alternatively, you can always just pull down the jQuery, looks like they're at a 1.10.1 now. Now, as far as which one you're going to want to grab, there's quite a few choices here. When doing development, you should always download the uncompressed versions of whatever library that you're using. See, JavaScript is typically what's called minified when you deploy into production, and that rewrites the JavaScript to be more compact. It changes variable and function names, and it removes white space. Now, while that's good for production because it allows your JavaScript files to be smaller, it's not so good for development because it just makes debugging just that much more difficult. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be pulling down the uncompressed development edition of jQuery 1.10.1. I'm actually going to do that here over on my virtual machine so that I get a copy of it on my virtual machine's file system. So I'm going to jump over to jQuery.com. And I'm going to hit this big download button, and then I'm going to right click on this and say save link as, and I'll dump it right into my downloads folder. Now, the next thing that we're going to be needing today is a build of jQuery UI. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can build out a jQuery UI. For example, if you jump over to custom downloader, you can pick and choose not only which one of the modules that you want, but also you can choose to use a different theme. You can even design your own theme. Now, in today's lesson, we're not actually going to be using any of the theming available within jQuery UI. So instead, I don't really care what the theme is. So I'm just going to sit here and go ahead and just hit download, and I'll get a nice little zip file that has been added to my downloads folder. So now that I have jQuery UI and jQuery, let's go ahead and pull them into a project folder somewhere so I can write some code that references it. I'm going to jump down into my XAMPP htdocs JavaScript week 3, and you'll see I already have my example HTML scripts, JS, and styles here. However, these are actually currently empty, except for some really basic markup that shouldn't need any explanation at this point. So I'm going to pull down, or I'm going to bring over jQuery into this folder, and then I'm going to jump into my custom jQuery zip file, jump into JS, or actually I'm going to jump into JS, and I'm just going to grab the jQuery UI 1.10.3 custom JS. Alright, so now I have both of the jQuery files that I'm going to be needing. Remember, if you're not using any of the jQuery UI functionality, there's no reason to pull it down into your site. Like I said myself, I don't really use it very often, to be honest, but like I said, it does provide some fun stuff that we can do. So now that we've done that, I need to go ahead and open up my HTML document and import in both jQuery and jQuery UI. So what you should like I said, what you should do last week, or I think the week before last week, you should always include your scripts at the end of your body tag in order to make sure that you don't have any blocking code within your scripts that could take your page or make your page load for a longer period of time before the user sees any content. So I'm going to say script equals, I'm going to pull over jQuery 1.10. Now notice how I'm pulling in jQuery first, then I'm going to pull down jQuery UI custom blah blah blah. Okay, so now I have those two scripts included. I am then going to include my scripts.js file, which, if you remember, contains the application logic for our program, which currently doesn't do anything. Again, notice how I am doing this at the bottom of the page after I include jQuery and jQuery UI. The ordering is significant because if you do not order it in this way, then you won't be able to use any of jQuery's functionality immediately within scripts.js. So at this point, nothing really changes. Here's our page. There's not a whole lot different because, well, we've included jQuery, but we haven't done anything with it. So let's start off with talking about some of the features of jQuery that we're going to be using, or some of the most important ones. Now, the name jQuery is not an accident. jQuery is very much about querying your DOM and retrieving data from it, or manipulating your DOM. All of the functionality that we've been using before with like create element and query selector and query selector all, that's effectively replaced by jQuery. So let's run through some very simple basic examples of using jQuery to perform some sort of DOM querying. I'll start off with, maybe we can go ahead and do a UL, and then I'll go ahead and give this an ID of my list, and I'll dump in some LIs. Item 1. I know this isn't super exciting, but yeah, there we go. We have a really, really awesome page that is going to change the world. And for some reason, my virtual machine decided that it was appropriate to hide my example page. There we go. So we have a basic UL with some LIs in it. Now let's do something fun with that. First example that I want to show you guys is I want to retrieve every single LI out of this UL. Now, in scripts.js, I'm going to open up with something that's going to look a little weird. You guys ready for this? Okay, so what is that and what's going on here? That $ money is what the jQuery variable is bound to. So that money sign is actually a variable. Specifically, it's an object. It's the jQuery object. Whenever you hear the word jQuery, you can just think this little money symbol. Now, there are ways to change what symbol it uses for compatibility with other frameworks, but 99% of the time when you're writing application code and not library code for reuse elsewhere, just using that will be okay. So I'm invoking the jQuery object right here. And what I'm doing is I'm passing in a function. Now, this should be fairly straightforward for people who followed along with last week, where we can pass functions into callbacks and all that fun stuff. What this actually does is this registers your function to be invoked when the DOM on the web page is done being loaded. Now, 99.9% of the time, because we're all good developers, we'll have our script tags at the end of your body statement or your body element. That really shouldn't make much tangible difference, but it still is a very important convention, because you don't want to start manipulating your DOM until you know it's loaded. In addition, because of the way JavaScript works, this opens up a new scope. And because it opens up a new scope, we don't have to worry about our local variables getting muddled with our main window object in JavaScript. So not only will this prevent us from accidentally having code execute before our document is ready, but it will also make sure that our local variables don't conflict with local variables of other scripts. So is everybody good with the money function? I know it might seem a little crazy. Okay, so let's do something simple. I want to select every one of these LIs. So how can I do that? Well, I can say LIs equals money, my list LI. And I can then go inside and say console log LIs. So what does that print out? Well, it prints out what we have here with an array of our LIs, each individual LI being pulled out. So this is the very, very simple usage of jQuery where we're able to query our document using selectors. That is 99.9% of the time you are going to be using this function, the jQuery function, to query some sort of DOM or some sort of query your DOM in some sort of way on your page. So let's make some stuff a little bit more interesting. What if I wanted to register a click handler on each one of these LIs? Well, I can say lis.click, function e.prevent defaults, which there's really not going to be any default behavior, but still, alert you clicked on me, or something like that. So now I can come back here, refresh, and every time I click on one of these LIs, it says you clicked on me. So that's interesting. Let's jump back into our style sheet really quickly, and because I want to add a hover state to my individual LIs, I want to give it a cursor of pointer, a background of dark gray, and a foreground of white. That's purely stylistic for now, but we'll see how that becomes interesting in a moment. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to say so now, every time when I click on one of these elements, we get them to be removed. Now, this small code example gives us a lot to talk about. First of all, let's back up all the way to our li's local variable. Our li's local variable is simply a query for all li's that appear underneath an element with the ID of my list. Aliasing it onto a variable like this isn't actually even necessary. I could have simply done that and have made the code a little bit more concise. Now, depending on quite a few different things, I might usually format my code a little bit like that just to make it slightly cleaner. So again, what we have going on here is we return an array of all of the LIs that are underneath this list. So we get a collection of them. But it's important to understand that what we get back isn't a collection of DOM elements. I mean, it technically is, but it's more than that. It's given a lot of additional functionality. We're not just getting back raw DOM elements like what we would get with create element and so on. What we're getting back are elements that have been decorated with jQuery, meaning this object or any object that is returned by the money function will be better. Not better, but it'll contain all of the jQuery's functionality. Otherwise, you wouldn't get the method such as click, because click comes from jQuery. Meaning, if I were to have done something like this, and I did mylist.click function blah alert, you clicked the list, what do you think that this code is going to do? Well, the answer is nothing. That's because what we're doing is actually, hold on, let me, I'm going to comment this out because there we go. Here's a better example. When I click on the list, nothing happens. And nothing happens because this is not a jQuery object, therefore it does not have the click function on it. If instead we wanted to add a click handler to an element that isn't retrieved through jQuery, what would we do? Well, we would say mylist.onClick equals this. And so now, when I come back here and click on the list, it says you clicked the list. So to explain why it's nicer to query through jQuery and attach our event handlers using their little helpers like .click, can anybody see a potential issue with this code in particular? Now, this is not using jQuery. This is using basic DOM manipulation. We are retrieving my list by ID, and we're attaching a click handler. So does anybody see any issues with this code? Well, it's not so much that they're similar names, it's that, well, we have this event handler is being replaced every time we would attach it to it. In addition, well, somebody pointed out that, yes, in this case, we are attaching an event handler to my list, as in the UL. whereas in this case we were able to do every single individual li that we wanted. But in this case, what we're doing is we're attaching an event handler. What if we wanted multiple things to happen when we clicked on your list? You could do it. In fact, there's a recent event API that's been added to JavaScript that also does it, but it's a lot more verbose than what is really necessary. Okay. So what we have here is a basic method invocation on document called getElementID, and that returns a normal HTML element to us. And that normal HTML element has an onClick property that we're attaching a function to. So what if instead we wanted to use jQuery? Well, there's two ways we can do it. We could either go ahead and wrap this in a invocation of jQuery, or we could select directly out using the #mylist, which would be preferable, but what I'm showing here is important to understand. If we wrap any normal HTML element within a function call to jQuery, what we get back is the jQuery representation of that element, meaning that this code will no longer work. As you see, nothing happens. That's because my list is now a jQuery object and not a normal object. One of the things that I like to do is I like to prepend my jQuery objects with a money sign to make it clearer to myself and to future readers of the code that I'm working with an element that has been wrapped by jQuery. Now, remember that in JavaScript, we can have money symbols within or dollar signs or whatever, within our variables. So now that I've made this a jQuery object, instead of doing onClick, we would do one of a couple things. Now we could say bind click function e. We can do that. As you see, we now have a click handler on it. This is the longhand way to perform a binding. There's a lot of events that we can bind to, and not all of them are actually from HTML itself. A lot of them are wrappers around other events that jQuery uses to make writing event handlers easier. In this case, click is so common that instead of doing mylist.bindClick function, instead we could do mylist_click function. Okay, so how's everyone doing with basic event handlers? I'm assuming that silence means good. Okay, let's rewrite line 3 to be more jQuery. I would go ahead and do, instead of doing document.getElementID mylist, I would instead just do a straight up mylist, which will select out that element with the ID of my list. Any valid CSS selector can go in here. Now that's not all that can go in there, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. There's a couple. I know that there's click is the one that I use all the time. I believe mouse leave and mouse enter and mouse move have shorthands to them, and I don't know about anything else. Either way, you can always do, even if an event isn't supported by the shorthand, you could always do a bind. Okay, so let's talk about something else. In this case, we have one HTML element that is being wrapped around by jQuery. But jQuery objects can actually have as many elements, 0 to many elements that are wrapped around them. And the cool thing about that is that any function that you call on a jQuery object will be applied to every single object that it contains. So what do I mean by that? Let's add another element here. I'm going to say ul id equals my list 2. And this is going to be list 2 item 1, and so on and so on and so on. So now we have 2 lists, right? One of them, when I click on it, will say you clicked the thing. The other one, when I click on it, will do nothing. That's because we haven't attached any event handlers to this DOM element right here. So how would I do that? Well, I could repeat myself and do another local variable and another click invocation, or I could write a selector that will select both of them. Now what we see here is an example of a selector, or of 2 selectors being combined by a comma, meaning this selector will return any object that has the ID of my list or my list 2. The cool thing about that is that'll all be stuffed in this one variable. Because they're all stuffed into this one variable, when I invoke click on it, it will apply to both of the elements. So now both of them have the exact same handler on them. There's other stuff we could do, obviously. I could say something like, instead of this, I would do maybe this dot remove. And now when I click on one element, it disappears. And if I click on the other element, it disappears too. So, again, what we have going on here is the ability to query out multiple elements and do something to all of them by just invoking one jQuery function on it. Now, all jQuery functions behave in this way. All right, so let's talk about this. Unfortunately, this is going to be something that is going to trip you up a lot. And if you don't fully get a grasp of this throughout this next bit of lecture, then just don't beat yourself up over it. It's something that will definitely come the more you start to use JavaScript, because this is actually one of the most confusing aspects of JavaScript. What we have going on here is this keyword called this, and it points to the context that this function is being invoked from. Meaning that technically I could have a function and I can change the context that it's invoked from on a per invocation basis. Now, this is a variable. Specifically, it's always going to be an object. Now, when you attach a handler, an event handler of any kind onto an object, the function that you pass in will be bound to the element that you're attaching it to. Meaning, if I were to say console.log this right up here, okay, so let's do a little experiment. I'm going to say console.log this, so I'm going to say console log in on ready this is in click this is. So I'm just console logging out a couple things. Right up here I'm printing out on ready this is, and then I'm printing out this. And then in a click handler I'm printing out this. I'm going to remove the remove functionality for right there for now for this example. Okay, so in on ready, this is a reference to the document. Is everybody with me? The this on line 6 is the document, the entire HTML document. And as you see, it has a bunch of properties about what our document is, such as our URL, character sets, and so on and so on. Is everybody good with that? On line 6. Now, watch what happens when I click on one of these lists. In click, this is, now we're looking at the element that was clicked. If I were to click on the other element, it would say in click this is blah. So what we have going on here is two invocations of my event handler that I defined here in line 8 through line 11. Both invocations have a different value of this. And they both point to whatever object had that click handler raised on it. However, this is not going to be a jQuery object, meaning if I were to say this.remove, hold on. See, when you use JavaScript or jQuery for a long time, you start to forget which methods are not available on jQuery itself. Let's do something else. Let's do console log, or how about alert type of this. That's not going to do it either. Anyway, the point is that the this that we're looking at in the click function is not, or the click handler is not a jQuery object. So what I need to do is I need to wrap it in a jQuery invocation so that we turn it into a jQuery object and we can reference it as a variable. Typically what I do is, again, I follow a convention where any jQuery object I have, I prefix with the jQuery symbol, and then I just call it money this, or currency this, or dollar this, or whatever you want to call it. So now I can go ahead and use money this, and I can do things like remove, which will remove it from the DOM. Okay, so let's go ahead and back up and talk about the other example now. That's a little bit more complex, but all the pieces are there. The first thing that we have going on here is a basic selector. Now, all the selector does is it selects all of the LIs out of my list. Now, because we're invoking click on this LI, or on these LIs that are underneath my list, one click handler will be registered for each one of these LIs. Meaning that the this in this context is always going to be an LI that was clicked on. Which means that simply by clicking on these elements, I can now remove them one by one, just by clicking on them. And that's being handled again by this click handler, which is being attached to every object that's returned by the selector. I could look at what objects are returned by the selector very easily. This is also something that you should become very familiar with doing while working with JavaScript, is using our console window. Because I can go ahead and say, I can invoke JavaScript or jQuery from the console window, and I can say my list li, and what I get back is, well, it's not printing out very prettily. It's only printing out the first item that was returned for some reason. But still, you get the point. If I did my list li.size, I only have, oh, derp. See, I was waiting for someone to catch that, see? Someone actually caught that. I'm impressed. Anyway, so now when I go ahead and say my list li, what we get is an array of all of these items. So using the console window to test out your queries or your selectors is very handy. So let's talk about some of the common methods that we will be using with jQuery. Because at the end of the day, jQuery's library just contains a bunch of functionality for making certain tasks easier to do. I recommend that you get very familiar with the jQuery API, because obviously it isn't feasible for me to sit down and talk about each one of the API methods in this class session, but yeah, it's just a bunch of stuff, and I'm just here showing you some stuff that I think is cool. So we've already seen attaching click handlers, we've already seen querying for objects, we've already seen the remove functionality. let's go ahead and do something else that's fun with jQuery. I'm going to remove that second list, and I'm going to add an A tag up here, and I'm going to say add item, and I'm going to give this guy an ID of add item button. Okay, so I have an add item button with a list, and the list has 4 elements. Now, I still want the list to remove every single element that you click on, but I want the add item button to add an element back in. So to do that, I'm going to say add item button, click function e.prevent default to prevent the browser from navigating to that URL fragment that I specified. Then I'm going to create a new li element and attach it to my list. Well, there's a very easy way to do that within jQuery. So in order to differentiate each one of the items, I'm going to create a local variable up at the top of my function, and I'm going to say var counter equals 0. And then I'm going to say money li text and then I'm going to do that. So what is this doing? Well, this is using another bit of jQuery syntax that we can pass into the money sign or the jQuery function. As you can see, we actually have, this is going to be the third case or the third type of invocation we can pass into jQuery. The first being just a normal function, which again will be invoked when the DOM is ready. The second will be an actual query, which will return elements that are matched by that selector. And the third form is creating an HTML element. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a new element, a new li, and I am returning it as a jQuery object. Now jQuery knows that we're creating a new element because we're starting off the text with a greater than sign. We could put whatever arbitrary HTML we want into this string, but in this case I'm keeping things fairly simple, where all I'm doing is I'm invoking the shorthand of document.createElement. The next thing that I'm doing is I'm invoking the text function on it. Now the text function, when you invoke it and pass in a string, what it's going to do is it's going to set the text of the element to whatever we passed into the text function. In this case, the text I'm passing in is the string literal item concatenated with my counter variable, and then I have the ++ there to increment my counter variable every time this function is invoked. After the text function is invoked, I then invoke the append_to function, and I pass in my list by selecting it out using the ID selector. Seeing a chained function invocation like this is very common, and you will do that very, very frequently with jQuery. However, I'll go ahead and show what this code would look like if I broke it out a little bit. Instead of chaining everything over and over again, I could just say var li equals, then I could say li.text, and then li.append_to. That code is functionally equivalent to when I had the method chaining. But the reason we can do method chaining is because almost always jQuery will return the same object that you invoked that function on, which again allows us to drastically clean up this code by doing some simple method chaining. So now when I jump back into my page, I can remove items and I can add items. So watch all those items that I'm adding. I have items 0 through item 7 were added to my list. But we have a problem. Can anybody see what the problem is? Well, it's not counting the existing items. That's not really what the problem I was talking about, but I could go ahead and solve that by initializing counter to myListLi.size plus 1. The size function will return the count of elements that were returned by this selector. So .size for myListLi will return however many items that we have. So now when I hit add item, we'll just continue to go up. Okay, so now what's the problem? Can anybody kind of guess? If you look at the code, we're doing something that actually we introduced last week as a problem as well. It's not so much as skipping the other items. The problem that we have right here is something that you're going to run in very frequently with old jQuery code, or old, see, there, you have me saying it too. It's not jQuery code, it's JavaScript. Anyway, when using jQuery or any JavaScript framework, or any JavaScript without a framework, you are going to run into the issue where dynamically inserting DOM elements will not have them be attached to the previous event handlers. There, mute, got it. There's no click functionality. When I click on a dynamically inserted element, it doesn't get removed. Is everybody good with that? So you see when I click on item 6, it doesn't get removed. It's not getting removed because I'm never attaching a click handler to this element. Now there's a couple ways I could fix this. I could go ahead and I could create a function down here called removeElementE. I could do that, and then I could do click remove element. So what I just did was I created a function down here called removeElement, and then I'm passing that function in directly into my click function, which will register this function as the click handler for both newly generated elements and existing elements. So now it works. So how's everyone feeling about this solution to the problem? Now there's an alternative. jQuery, one of my favorite features of jQuery that's been introduced in the last couple of versions, can't remember which one, is the concept of a live event handler. Now, the API for live event handling has changed a little bit over the last major version of jQuery, but the change is fairly simple to implement. What I'm going to do is I am going to cut this code, and I'm going to delete all of this. And I'm just going to leave the code as it is right here. And instead of selecting every single LI out of my list and attaching a click handler on it, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say my list on click LI function. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm using the on function. Now the on function will bind any event that we pass into the first parameter, and it'll bind it to any objects that match this selector that we're passing in as a second parameter, and then it'll use this function as the event handler. So this is the event type we're binding for. This is the selector that we're binding for, and then this is the function that we're attaching as event handler. What this does is this actually attaches an event handler onto my list. But what you can think of it as is what happens is it attaches an event handler onto my list, but it will only fire when an element is clicked inside of my list that matches this selector that we pass in as a second argument. So what it allows us to do is it allows us to very simply write events for objects that are inserted dynamically or already exist on the page. All right, how's everyone doing with on? It's one of my more favorite jQuery bits of functionality. So this in the function is the second element in on. So that this is the function is second element on. You mean this? The this on 16? Yeah, this is going to be whatever element that started this event from happening. There's actually a bit of a discussion that at some point we should probably have next week on event propagation and how the on function actually works. But for now, it's important just to realize that if you're working with a page that has elements that are inserted dynamically, it may be a lot easier and cleaner to use the on instead of doing a bunch of binding. Anyway, the point is, again, the point of this lesson is to talk about some of the awesome features of jQuery that I use all the time, not so much be an exhaustive reference of jQuery itself, because they provide that on their homepage. Okay, so before we go on break, what I want to do is introduce one more thing. Let's see. Let's do a couple more functions that I really like about jQuery. One of them is that I'm going to be using very extensively is the addClass, the removeClass, and the toggleClass functions. So instead of removing this, I want to do this.toggleClass completed. So what the toggleClass does is, well, if the class is on the element, it removes it. And if the class is not on the element, it doesn't. That's about, yeah. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can use this. First of all, if I jump back over here and show you guys the DOM of my UL, notice how when I click on these items, the completed class appears. So if you wanted to just style that real quickly, I could say mylist li.completed, color red, text decoration, what is it, line through or strike through? I always forget this one for some reason. Line through. Is that not how you spell through? Okay. And then I'll change the cursor to, nah, I won't change the cursor. So now when I come back here, I can click on the elements and I can toggle whether or not they've been completed. So that's neat. Other bits of functionality that we might want to use from jQuery. Again, there's an addClass and a removeClass. They do this the thing that you'd expect them to. They just add CSS classes or remove CSS classes from an element. I mean, yeah, that's actually incredibly powerful if you think about it. Because, for example, I could have like a element that gets shown or hidden underneath the li that gets shown or hidden based off whether or not that class exists. Okay, so are there any questions so far? I know this might seem really straightforward. We're definitely going to see a more complete example of jQuery once we get back from break. I mean, I take it that this is as straightforward as it can be, unless anybody has any questions. All right. So yeah, I think about that wraps up the basic introduction to jQuery. When we get back from break, I'm going to go ahead and rebuild the to-do application using jQuery and show how much cleaner the code is going to be once we introduce the shortcuts that jQuery allows us to do. Alrighty, and we're back. So let's go ahead and look at using jQuery to build more of an application that does something cool. It's basically just going to be us writing the to-do application again, but we're going to use some features of jQuery UI in order to make it a little bit nicer, and we're going to be using jQuery itself to make our syntax very clean compared to how it was before. So like always, let's start off with writing our markup. It's generally where you have to start. So I'm going to use basically the same markup that I did last week. So I'll have our to-do today list with a UL, and actually, you know what? This should really be an OL because they're going to be ordered. And then we'll have an LI, and we'll have item 1, href, blah, blah, event X. And then we'll have a couple items in to do today. In addition, I'm also going to be making this a little bit more interesting by inserting a text box at the top. That will be used to insert text items a little bit easier than what we did before with that button. So I'll have a to-do tomorrow. So we'll have 3 lists. And there's our markup. So not super exciting. It looks like that. Let's go ahead and fix it up just a little bit with our styles to make things just a little bit nicer. I'm going to say section is going to be float left width 33.33%, box sizing, border box. Let's give it a padding of 0 in the vertical direction, 10 in the horizontal direction. Then let's also style our H1s just a little bit because I want to get rid of that nasty margin that they have and maybe introduce a 3-pixel padding. So that looks a little bit more sensible. Now let's start off with our completion. Whenever I click one of these X's, I want each item to be completed. So just like what we did before, I'm going to remove all this. I'm going to create a function, and I'm going to call this prepare list type. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke it. So prepare list today, tomorrow, and future. Then I'm going to say var section equals type. So when we invoke our prepare list function, we're going to have a local variable called section, which is a jQuery object that represents each one of these sections. So there's a couple things I need to do. First of all, I need to bind to their input for events so I can add items to the list, and I'll also need to bind to these A tags. So let's do the A tags first. I'm going to do section.on click a function e.prevent default, so we don't have that nasty URL fragment being added to our URL. Then I'm going to do this addClass completed. So whenever we click on those X's, we get a class called completed added to our thing, or our A tag. Now this actually won't work quite the way we want it to, because if we come back here and refresh, we'll notice something interesting. Or maybe not, depending on how closely you guys are paying attention. Because if I click this X, notice how the class completed gets applied to the A tag. I actually want the class completed to get applied to the LI tag, which is the parent of the A element. So to do that, I'm going to say, instead of this .addClass completed, I'm going to say this .parent addClass completed. It's important to note that I am doing parent, but it is a function. Parent is a function. Because it's a function, I have to add those empty parentheses. So what parent will do is it'll return the jQuery object that represents the parent element. So now if we go back and I hit this X, notice how the class get completed gets applied to the LIs. So let's really quickly jump back and style our elements just a little bit more. I wanted to go ahead and do UL, or how about li dot completed, color is red, text decoration equals line through, and then I want to say li dot completed a display none. I want the a tag to disappear when an item's completed. So now when we come back, and again, all our JavaScript is doing is it's grabbing the section element out using a basic selector. The selector is what we're passing into the function. And then it's adding a click handler to the A tags. So now when we click on these items, notice how they turn red, they get a strike through, and all that stuff is good. Except for my to-do tomorrow list isn't working right, and that's probably because I misspelled tomorrow. Okay, so that's really neat, but not a whole lot different than what we had before. I guess the biggest difference of what we had before is that this code is already a whole lot cleaner. There's no nasty looping through everything or all of that ugly stuff. So that's really cool. So let's go ahead and introduce adding an item. If we go back into our markup, we'll see that we have this input type text on each one of these sections. So I want to select that input out, and I want to bind to an event handler of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a new jQuery function we haven't seen before called find. And I'm going to say, and then I'm going to attach to our handy little key press function or event. So is everybody good with that? I guess I could go ahead and prove that it's working by saying console log E. And then if I go back here and start typing in stuff, we'll see that we are indeed attaching to the key press event of each one of our awesome little thingies. So I want this to work the way I want this to work is every time you press enter, I want to go ahead and add a new item to the list. So to do that, I'm going to detect if enter was pressed. So I'm going to say if e.which equals 13, then we know enter was pressed and we need to insert a new element into our DOM. Otherwise, we don't need to do anything. So now that we've gathered or we know when enter was pressed, we now need to know the text of our input. To do that, I'm going to alias out our this like that, and then I'm simply going to say console.log this.val. Now, the val function is again something that was introduced with jQuery, and it allows us to retrieve the value of any input. The 13 is going to be the key code for the enter button. So e.which is going to return our key code for whatever key was pressed, and 13 just happens to be the return key. So now, if I go ahead and say item whoa and hit enter, notice how item whoa gets printed out to the console. If I click here and look at where that was logged out, I can see it was logged out right here. So that's cool. So now we can get our text. So I'm going to say var item title equals this.val. Then I'm going to say this.val empty. Now, what's interesting about what I'm doing is I'm invoking the val function, but I'm passing a string into it. Now that string is going to replace whatever the value is of that element. So in this case, I am blanking out that element, kind of like how you would expect a chat box to work. So now if I come back in, I can type in item 1, hit enter, item 2 and hit enter, and nothing happens because I deleted the console log. but you get what's going on. So now that we have the item title gathered out into a local variable, I can now insert a new element. So I'm going to say, open up a new li with an a tag, I'm going to give it a text of item title, and I'm going to append it to section.findUL. Alright, well, we're getting closer there, but ain't quite working. Let's see here. We got... OL. Oh, derp. See, I'm so used to using unordered lists that I forgot that I actually made these OLs, didn't I? Anyway, at least someone's paying attention. That's cool. So now I can go ahead and say item 5, item 6, item 7. Now, we don't have any of those A tags being presented to us, and the reason we don't is because I never put text inside of the A tags. So let me go ahead and add that back in. So now we have that X being passed into that A tag, which it's going to be overridden anyway with this text. So there's a couple ways that we could do that, or do this. We could insert the A tag afterwards, which would look something like this. We could say .append, open up an A tag with a text of X. And I think that would be the preferred way of doing this particular example. Of course, I need an href of an empty URL fragment in order for it to turn into a link. So, after all of that, we're almost there. The last thing is we need a text node in between our A tag and our previous text node in order for there to be a space between the two. That's easy enough to toss in. All we got to do here is append a space after our item title. So let me go ahead and move this over here. Compactify this a little bit so you guys can see what's going on with the code. And now we have our items being inserted into our DOM like that. Very straightforward. The last thing that I don't really like about this is I can just keep on hitting enter and get a bunch of empty items. I don't want that to happen. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to say if we hit 13 and our item title is blank, I'm going to say if item title.trim.length equals 0, then return. So that way we can't add empty items. The trim function, by the way, is just a function that are on all strings that chop off spaces at the beginning and end of an item or of a string, which means that if I just fill this up with spaces, nothing will happen until I add in an item. Okay, so how's everyone feeling about this code compared to what we had last week? It's fairly straightforward. Again, jQuery is all about just making working with JavaScript bearable. So we have a lot of really nice things that we can use, such as using live event handlers. We can use the find method to further specify an element. So if you recall, a find method will take in a selector within the context of another element, which is really cool. And then we also have element creation being made very easy. So as you'll notice here, what we're doing is we're creating two elements. We're creating the li, then we're setting its text, then we're appending on a new element of an A tag, and then we're appending all of this to our OL that we found in our section. Let's go ahead and do one more fun thing before we toss in some sortable stuff. I want to talk really quickly about data. Now, obviously, in this class, we're not going to be talking about web servers or functionality that would come from PHP or ASP.NET and all that fun stuff. But in reality, you would generally have each one of these entities, these to-do list items, have some sort of ID attached to them, because we need to know the ID of these elements in order to tell the web server what item the user clicked on to complete an item, for example. So I want to really quickly introduce the basic data API, and that was actually introduced with HTML5, but jQuery gives us some a really nice ability to handle that as well. In HTML5, what we can do is on any element, we can attach additional attributes that don't actually exist in the specification, as long as we prefix them with data dash. So I can say data-id equals 1. And then I can say data-id, hold on. So data-id equals, oh, come on, Sublime. You can do this. 3 and 4. And then I would go ahead and do this down here. I would basically be giving each one of these items their own unique ID, so the server would know when you clicked on an item, what item was clicked on. So by doing that, I can now access this attribute from within jQuery very easily. Now, we don't have a server to inform if an item was completed or not yet, but what we can do is I'm going to go ahead and in my click handler, I'm going to say var li equals this parent, just to alias that out so I don't have to repeat myself over and over again. And then I'm going to say var id equals li.data id. And then I'm going to say console log completing item ID. So at this point, what we can do is the server would generate this markup and put in these special little data ID attributes into our LIs, and then our JavaScript can pull them out by invoking the data function. Which, if we come back into JavaScript and open this up, and when I click on this, it says completing item, and then it gives us the ID. Now, there was a question why I don't have the money on ID. And the reason I don't is because this is a basic variable. This is just an integer, or I think actually it's a string, that was returned by the data function. It's not a jQuery object. The reason I have this, the $sign right here, is just a convention that I have for local variables, just to say this li variable is a jQuery object. Just so people know if I'm working with jQuery objects or if I'm working with normal objects. Well, remember, this ID is all this is going to be a string that's returned by data. Not all jQuery functions return a jQuery object. Most of them do, but not all of them. Data is an example of one that doesn't. At least this invocation of data doesn't, because there's another type of invocation of data that does, which we'll be talking about almost immediately. So now we have the problem of, okay, so the web server presented this markup to the user. And the web server is saying, okay, so this li has an ID of 1, this li has an ID of 2, blah, blah, blah. We need that information so that when the user clicks on something, we can tell the web server what item they clicked on. But now we have another problem. When we generate an item and we complete it, it says completing item undefined because we never set the data attribute on it. So what I'm going to do is there's a couple ways I can do this. The simplest way is that I'm going to go ahead and query for all my LIs and get the amount of LIs that I have and use them as a counter. So I'm going to say var last ID equals li size plus 1. This will give us a last ID of 13, which I believe is, yeah, that's the next item. So it's a little tacky, but it'll work, because the point isn't about how we generate IDs. The point is how we attach them back onto our elements. So when I create an element in this event handler, I create this li element, I want to attach on an ID to it. So to do that, I'm going to say .data ID last ID plus plus. Now, this plays back to what I just said a minute ago. This invocation of data, when you provide one argument, just returns the data that was contained within that particular data item. When you invoke data with two elements, you are setting this data element or data attribute to this value, and it will return the jQuery object. Now, you will notice something interesting about this. If I look at the DOM, we'll see that the data actually doesn't exist as part of the element's attributes. But it's still there, as you can see. That's just because the nature of how data works. So the data function, when we use it to set a piece of data, it doesn't actually modify the DOM and attach that attribute to the element. But it does stuff the data into a place that is later accessed when we retrieve it. Now, the reason for that is not everything that you can pass into the data function right here is able to be attached to the DOM. The only thing we can attach to a DOM are basic strings, whereas with this we can attach full objects if we wanted to. If we really wanted to attach a data item using the DOM instead of the internal jQuery data repository or whatever it's called, we could use, instead of .data, we would use .attr. And I would say attr data ID is last ID plus plus. The difference is that attr will actually set an attribute on this element, which we can see an example of right here, where it was indeed added to the DOM. Now, to be honest, it really doesn't matter which one you use. It kind of does. It does if you plan on selecting elements based off of some data attribute. Then you would want to set the attr of that element. Otherwise, I would just use data and have jQuery be responsible for containing that data. So just to recap, when you invoke the data function to retrieve data out of an element, it will first look for the internal invisible data that jQuery stores for your object, and if it can't find anything there, it'll look at the element itself, which is very handy because then we can simply use basic HTML to add data into our DOM and make stuff very clean and easy to work with. So how's everyone feeling about data? Alrighty, so let's go ahead and wrap up with one more fun little thing. Let's talk about one of the features of jQuery that we have called Sortable. And that comes actually from jQuery UI. And this is just a quick example of just one of the things that you might want to use that's built in with jQuery UI. Again, I don't find myself using jQuery UI too often. There are other things that replace a lot of jQuery UI's functionality that are out, such as like Twitter Bootstrap. But sometimes it really is just really easy to, plop in a sortable or something fun like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, at the top of my prepare list function, I am going to say, I'm actually going to go ahead and, when I yanked out that OL out of section right here on line 27, I'm going to go ahead and alias this out into a variable called list. And then I'm going to define that list variable up here. And I'm going to do that just so I don't have to continuously repeat myself to find the OL. It's just a lot nicer to do it this way. So I'm going to say list.sortable. Now, the sortable function comes from jQuery UI. And by doing that, what I've effectively done is made each element be able to be dragged and dropped. So the styling isn't that great at the moment, so let's fix that up first. If we look at our elements, we'll notice that as we drag them, it gets a, I don't know if you guys can see that down there. As we drag an element, it gets a UI Sortable Helper class attached to it, which means we could style the UI Sortable Helper. In addition, there's a placeholder element being added in whenever we are hovering over another element. That gets this, you can read all about this in the documentation for Sortable, but I just wanted to quickly overview that because what I want to do is I want to style out my placeholder a little bit differently. However, you'll notice that it has visibility set to hidden, which means that I have to go in and actually tell the sortable function to behave a little bit differently. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in a placeholder of placeholder. Now, what we see here is an example of a very common pattern when using jQuery functionality that has been added onto it. And that is we are passing in an object into the sortable function that configures what the sortable will do. And in this case, we're saying the placeholder is going to be .placeholder, or sorry, not .placeholder, just placeholder. And what that means is that it's going to now create an element with the class of placeholder that I can then style. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a placeholder style. I'm going to give it a background of blue. I don't know. So now when we come back to our code, we'll notice that we have that nice little placeholder that is indicating to the user where I'm about to drop the item onto. I guess what I could also do is I could say UI sortable helper. I could go ahead and give him a box shadow of 0 pixels, 0 pixels, 5 pixels, RGBA 000.4 or something with a background of white and a border 1 pixel solid light gray with a border radius of 5 pixels. Okay, so now we can sit here and drag our items around. Actually, you know what would look really cool? If I gave my, instead of background of blue, I gave it a inset box shadow with 3px in the x direction with a background of light gray. That might look kind of neat. Yeah, it looks okay. So anyway, that's how we can go ahead and style our drag thingies a little bit. Let's talk about how we can drag and drop from one list to another. Well, what we can do is we can pass in another property called connect with. The connect with property is going to connect this drag and drop list with another one, or any ones that are returned by the following selector. The selector I'm going to pass in is section OL, which means I want to connect this sortable with every other OL that's underneath the section on my DOM. So now when I come back here, I can now drag and drop all my items. Alright, so how's everyone feeling so far? Okay, so the last thing that I would want to do is at some point I'm going to need to tell the server that the user has moved an item from one point to another. Can I turn my cursor to a hand? Yeah, I'm actually going to go ahead and say li cursor pointer, then I'm going to say section ol list style none. There. Now the padding is going to slightly break my, unfortunately, I'm just going to leave the padding and margin to whatever so that my placeholder doesn't freak out. Which it already is starting to freak out. Now there's a particular reason that our placeholders are no longer working. And to fix it, what I need to do is I need to add another option into my sortable, and I need to say, what is it? I think it's something like force placeholder size. There we go. And what that does is it makes the placeholder height be the height of the element that just left, which causes the item to have the appropriate height. Okay, so that is all CSS. Yep. You can do a lot with CSS, these days anyway. And my philosophy is if you get away with doing something in CSS, it's usually best to. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do is we do need to go ahead and find out what our lists, or whenever we reorder our list, we need to tell the server what the user did, basically. So to do that, I'm going to handle an event called stop. And I'm going to pass that into my list sortables constructor, you could call it, by saying stop :function. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to construct I'm going to use jQuery to construct an object that represents my position of all of my items, or the position of all of my items. So what I need to do is I need to loop through all of my lists. How can I do that? Well, I'm going to go ahead and add a class to each one of my sections, or I'm going to add a data to each one of my sections. I'm going to say data dash list type equals today, data type list type equals tomorrow, list type equals future. So this way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use jQuery to loop through each one of these sections, grab their list type, loop through each one of their OLs, and then create a JavaScript object that can be used to represent the ordering and the positioning of each one of our items, so that we can submit that data to the server and the server can save it in a database. So I'm going to say .section.each function IE, or actually I don't even need that, because I can go ahead and say var this equals this, and then I can say var list equals this data list type, and then I'm going to say var positioning equals empty object, items equals new array. Then I'm going to say items equals this find ol li, or how about just li dot map function, return this, or data ID positioning at list equals items console log positioning. So don't worry, I'll explain what's going on there in a second, once I verify that it works. We're actually getting some objects back, which isn't what I wanted. Blah, 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 blah. Actually, no, I think that's just jQuery itself attaching on some really annoying yeah, jQuery is attaching on a whole bunch of things onto my array, which I don't really like, but that's alright, doesn't matter. The point is what we have going on here is the stop function is invoked when the sortables, when someone has finished sorting an element. Then what I do with the stop function is I create an object called positioning. This object is going to represent the positioning of all the items within my list. Then I loop through every single section element in my DOM, and I do a .each. Now, .each will run this function that I pass in for every item that was returned. So it's basically a shorthand of a loop, but like I discussed last week with the for-each function, it creates new scope. Then, for every section, I create 3 variables. The first one is this, which is just standard. As you see, I've been doing it quite a bit here. The next one is list, which I need to know when I'm looking at a section, I need to know what list type I'm looking at. Am I looking at today, tomorrow, or future? And I retrieve that by getting the list type data out of it. Then I need my items. And my items I'm just going to set to an empty array for now. And the reason I did that is because this line was going to get a bit crazy if I didn't do it. Then I say items equals this find li.map. Now the map function is really cool because it takes in a JavaScript collection that runs this function through every single item that was returned from that collection, and then it basically returns that modified version of the function. So for every single li that's inside of a section, it runs this function. This function then returns the ID that was retrieved from that specific li. So it's very similar to the select method in link. Then I set the positioning at list, which remembers my type of my list, equals items, and then I console log out all of my positioning. You could theoretically replace this with telling the web server that the user reordered the items. So if I come back here and move my items around, what I have is today is an array of 0. Future has an array of item 9, 10, 11, 12. And tomorrow has items 4, 3, 2, 1, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. Like for example, if I were to move 4 all the way to the top, and then look at what it looks like now on tomorrow, we'll see that 8 is the first item. So this data structure can be used to infer not only where each item is in which list it's in, but also what order it's in. So that way you could take that data and you can shoot it off to the web server and it could be persisted into a database. Alright, so how's everyone feeling? Or sorted and shot back? I mean, the sorting, if you wanted to sort it, you would do it on the client, because in this case the sorting that is being done is a manual sorting by the user. The user gets to decide what order things are in. There's no logic that's sorting items by their IDs or their names or anything like that, if that makes sense. Okay, so we definitely did go through a lot of stuff today. The main focus was on jQuery And to define jQuery again, jQuery is just a JavaScript library that makes writing common JavaScript code a lot easier. So we see examples of that by being able to query elements by just using that one character. We also see examples of us being able to create new HTML elements and also binding event handlers. So we talked about that, and then we also talked about the jQuery UI, at least one of the UI widgets in particular called the Sortable. And so that allows us to walk away with a lot more functionality that we had last week, but with a lot less, well, not a lot less code, but about the same amount of code, maybe a little bit less. So yeah, I think that just about wraps up everything today. Just to reiterate the nature of JavaScript is taking a bunch of little tools that you kind of figure out over the years and mashing them together to create products. So I would really encourage people to follow through in this example, because we do actually have a relatively finished client-side application. And just following through it, I hope will be very helpful in and stuff. We did get a question. I thought you cannot refer to a variable that was created in a function from outside of that function, like items. You can. I think you may be referring to positioning, where I declare the declare the variable on line 18, but I'm accessing it on line 29. Because items is only used within this one function. It's not used within any other function. But for positioning, what we have is, there's nothing wrong with this code. You're certainly allowed to do that. You can always reach into the parent scopes and access data from parent scopes. That allows us to write code like this, where we're modifying this element within a closure. Now, if we did something like this, then it would be very dangerous. Because what we have going on here is we're doing a window.setTimeout, and the window.setTimeout is going to invoke the function passed into it later. Even though I pass 0 and it has the timeout variable, the way JavaScript works, because it's single-threaded, this is still going to be invoked after the stop function is invoked, which means that we will now have an empty object. And we have an empty object because this function gets shot off into another context and doesn't complete before we reach line 34. So sometimes when you access a variable from within a parent scope, you'll run into problems. Sometimes you won't. I happen to know for a fact that the each function will complete immediately. If I can find out where this, there we go. I know that the each function will sit here and complete immediately and block, and until it will not invoke line 32 until each one of these function callbacks are invoked. So it's safe for me to reference this variable from outside of it. If that makes sense. It wouldn't be safe if I was doing something like creating a callback or something. Well, it technically would, depending on how the scoping works. JavaScript scoping is a bit of a trip, I know, I'm sorry. Push back at when to each generic function that was in the section of code. But anyway, the funny thing about this code is that, with the exception of the stop function, which is just something I wanted to show off a couple more jQuery type things, the code is very short, and that's the whole point of jQuery. So I think that about wraps up week 3, and I'll see all you future people later.